Welcome to part 4 of our series for this April National Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We are talking to students and folks involved with South Asian Performing Arts and Dance Network, talking about sexual assault, how we support survivors, and what changes are being made. I'm going to be your host and moderator for this discussion. My name is Rukmini, and I'm a community outreach liaison at Raksha, Inc. We work for healing, empowerment, and justice for South Asian survivors of violence. So Aditi, Amulya, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me. As we get started, could y'all just introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how you came to work advocating for survivors in the Desi dance community?
So I can start off with the introduction of myself. So I'm a recent alumni of Georgia Tech. I was captain of GT Bhangra for 1 year, but I was on the team for, I think, 3 years. And I grew up in the Bay Area in California.
So I'm currently a Georgia Tech student, but will be graduating this semester. And I'm currently the captain ETL DDN, and have been for the past 2 years. So this is my 3rd year, have been on the team for 4 years. And yeah, I mean, we've both been captains of dance teams at Georgia Tech. And I think after attending, several dance competitions, both nationally and locally, we kind of saw this need to address instances of sexual violence in the DDN community. And I think that kind of just gave us a push to kind of start this.
So can y'all talk a little bit about the kinds of work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I can start off with that. So I was on a call with a couple other DDN members, and we were just talking about kind of sexual violence in our community and what DDN could do. But one thing that they mentioned was that in Philly, they have this coalition with the teams and the competitions that are in that area, and they discuss issues in the community in general. So I know they had stuff about how they can support BLM and just some other issues. And I really liked this idea of having a coalition. And so basically I just kind of created a group chat with all the teams and the comp boards. And I wanted to start with, addressing sexual violence in our community. And after making the group chat, I asked if there was anyone else who wanted to get involved. And this is when Amulya, who's here, and then Isha and Haram, who are not here, joined the team. And so once we formed kind of our, leadership, we decided to form and implement a policy first regarding sexual violence. And so we also wanted to have a training to support it. So we organized a training last fall with Voice, which is Georgia Tech's sexual violence prevention organization. And they also, help support victim survivors as well. So we wanted to make sure that, each team followed through with kind of having this routine training. And we also want to make sure that our role as an organization, so we call ourselves the ETL DDN Coalition Accountability Team. So we wanted to have more of an accountability role because we can't, control what each team is doing. That's the captain's job. But what we can do is we can, create the structure where we're keeping them accountable.
Our main work this past year was has been perfecting our policy and making sure that it was strong linguistically and we were using the appropriate language. And, we just wanted to make sure that we were supporting the victim survivor in the best way possible. And we wanted to, so with our policy, we wanted to emphasize the incidence of sexual violence in general in the college community, and as well kind of narrow into the DDN community, and also address the LGBTQIA community as well. And, after kind of that initial introduction to it, we moved on to define the most prevalent forms of sexual violence in our dance community. And we definitely realized it's not limited to what we have, but these are what we've seen, kind of seen at competitions. And, these definitions are there to both help the survivor and our general audience kind of to understand the different forms of sexual violence. And then also in our policy, in order to support the survivor, we included both college-based and nationally based organizations as resources. And we also included different reporting options. And we also included one that'll be like local to our group specifically, which is our like anonymous tip line form, or like our tip line form. We're kind of still working out the details. And like throughout this year, we've gone through like several iterations of the policy, and we've like consulted several leaders in the sphere. And currently we're at the point where we feel confident with the policy, and we're working with our coalition members to implement it. So like the other like teams and like competition boards in Atlanta. And once we have like implemented the policy, our plan is to kind of look into creating a document with specific instances of each type of sexual violence that we've seen in our community. And we want to use that as like a calling in doc, so people can use that to, examine their own behaviors and kind of think about if they've experienced something like that as well. And, we're also like throughout this whole process, we've been consulting people within DDN, and we're also consulting with kind of people who are focused on creating this training that's more culturally relevant to the Indian community. But yeah.
Very cool. So how'd y'all figure out like what the key points were that you wanted to address in the policy?
So we there's this other group that we refer to them as the DDN Sexual Violence Response Task Force. So they had created this code of conduct, and it was really nice for us because it kind of gave us a roadmap, so to say, of how we wanted our policy to look at. And we also looked at ATS, which is Aton Showdown, which is like a comp board that I was a part of. They had a white paper about how, kind of denouncing sexual violence in the community. And so we had kind of these instances of policies. I also looked just online to see if there was anything. There wasn't that much online, but that's kind of how we went about it. We had these codes, and we had an idea of, how do we want to go about creating our policy? The first thing I thought we should do is like, we talked about how we should talk about the incidence of sexual violence in the college community in general. I wish there was data specifically in the DDN community, which, it isn't there yet. But we just want to talk about it in general, and also focus on like the LGBTQIA plus community, and just acknowledge that, in terms of, they are disproportionately affected when it comes to this topic. So we started with that, and then obviously the definitions, the DDN SVR task force had the code of conduct, and they had a lot of definitions in there. We added a couple of our own just from stuff we found online, or when we were talking to different, leaders in the community. They said, oh, like, why don't you include this? So I think like we included incapacitation, we included retaliation, sexual orientation based harassment. So we try to be as inclusive as we can as possible, while also just, it's impossible to like define like every instance of sexual violence, but that's something we did. And we also knew we wanted to add resources that people could contact, just like for the survivor, as well as we wanted to let them know that, we wanted to create another service of, if they don't want to go to Title IX, which, in our community, I've seen very rarely in terms of if they do experience something, they won't go to Title IX or going to law enforcement. So that's where our tip line form came in, where internally we would handle it.
Yeah. I love that y'all are like giving folks options, but I'm wondering like in your end, like when you talk about accountability or like handling it internally, what does that look like?
Yeah, so we wanted to create this like tiered policy where if something is reported to us, we kind of use that as like a guideline. It's not like exact, and it depends on, of course, each instance. But like for some of the kind of, I know an example, like if one of our like, if you're reported for using like comments perpetuating rape culture, one of our like sanction is we have like a 2-strike policy for that, right? So if you get reported once, you only have one more chance. Again, if you get that second report like another report against you, you're going to be suspended from whatever organization you are part of in the dance community for 4 years. And then again, after the 4 years, they can reapply, but that's like very contingent upon like education. So like another thing we've been really pushing for is that if you're reported, that you have to go through this education process. Like we want to make sure everyone's kind of learning through this process and they're fully like understanding why their actions were incorrect. And like the comments perpetuating rape culture is our only 2-strike system. Everything else is either a 4-year suspension immediately or expulsion from the team completely. And like during the suspension or like end the expulsion, you're not allowed to attend like any dance related events, or like whether that be like workshops, info sessions, competitions, after parties, all of that. And the reason we're kind of emphasizing that part is we want to make sure that the survivor feels safe in any instance that any like environment that they go to, right? We want to support the survivor, and like, so that's kind of why we're pushing that part. And then, like I said, we're definitely pushing education. We don't want to just completely blacklist the person, but we do want them to hopefully learn and make sure they don't repeat these type of actions again.
When y'all have talked to survivors, or y'all have talked to folks who like do sexual violence prevention work, like what does that feedback looked like? What have those conversations been like?
Well, it's kind of hard to sum it up because like since basically June until now, and we're still going through the process, we've been kind of talking to them at least like once a month, or like as soon as we make kind of like a substantial change in our policy. There's a lot of learning that's going on the side of like the coalition accountability team, because this isn't something any of us, like we are passionate about it, but it's not something that I would say we were skilled at all. We were really starting from the bare bones. It was just something we were passionate about. So a lot of that feedback, it's like, even just like linguistically, like, we've also talked to people at GT Pride Alliance and just like linguistically, like, oh, think about using these terms. Or, one thing in the beginning, I remember I was like, we have to make sure we're not using he or she, but we're using their, so it's gender neutral. I think I went into it thinking it would be a 6-month thing, but it took a year, and I'm honestly grateful for that because I think we learned so much.
And I think also like just in general, the feedback has been like positive, or the support has been positive. And, everyone's been really willing to just kind of help us through the process, and like good critiques have been like really supportive with it. And like Aditi said, it's been a learning curve for us. Like none of us are definitely like not trained for this or anything like that. So, yeah.
So like, obviously y'all have had to educate yourselves, and that's been a process. So like what, tools or strategies have you learned from that are going to help you educate others?
Yeah, I think for me, even before this whole process started, I was like, I think dialogue is so important, like creating a dialogue in our team, like being able to discuss it. I think like when we had that first meeting with all of the coalition members, we created questions to ask so that, just like understanding where everyone was at, we had certain scenarios, and just like understanding, I think one thing that sometimes people think it gets complicated is like when alcohol is involved and, someone's limits are pushed, but realizing that, consent is not a blurry line. So those are some of the tools. And even in our policy, I think the issue that we have in our community is that there's no accountability. Like I've seen perpetrators of sexual violence, commit these acts, and they'll still be part of the community, whether as a DJ, a dancer, a judge. It's very easy to make your way back into the DDN community because it's so large. Something that happens in Georgia, someone in California is not really going to know about it. And so I think that's our main thing. Like we want the perpetrator themselves to like realize what they did is wrong. And, we want to give the tools. One of the things of our tiered policy is having education. And that involves going to a mental health professional. So we want to give them the tools to improve. And it's also like we've realized, we could give them, like, they could do a year of counseling and not improve, but at least like they were given that tool. I think that's, what we notice is like missing in our community. Like, the survivor has to go through like all this stuff, if they report to Title IX or law enforcement, but like, where is like, and most of the time, the perpetrator won't, in my opinion, be rightfully punished, but like, where's the tools to educate the perpetrator on like why what they actually did is wrong?
Yeah. When does your policy officially come out? Has it come out already?
Not yet. I think right now we're in the process of, so I know at least at Georgia Tech, or like a lot of the dance teams have like this contract, and we kind of want them to merge our policy into their contract for each team. And kind of once we get, each team like established in that this contract is officially part of their team's like rules and regulations, that's kind of like our first step to get it like implemented. And then after that, I think next step is like releasing it to the public and like letting people, like other dancers, know that this is something that we are working on, and that the like Atlanta will be held accountable, like Atlanta DDN will be held accountable for it, kind of. But yeah.
Are there other coalitions in like geographical areas that have like done the same thing before? Are y'all the first?
So that's one thing, like, for ATS, like I was on the board for it. And one of the members, Eamon, was, she worked at Raksha and she was very passionate about this issue. So, she would have, like, during our competition, she would have, like, we got training as liaisons, as board members, about what to do in situations where we see, a sexual violent act happening during the weekend, during the competition weekend, and just in general too. And we also had like a couple policies in place at the after party about ways that people could report if something happened to them, because most of the time it's like during the after party that like one of these things happens, in terms of the dance weekend and in the dance community. But I think it's something that, sporadically some teams will do or some comps will do. But I think recently there's been a shift of, okay, like we actually need to work on this, just with like some internal instances that have come out in the DDN community. It happens sporadically, and I think everyone's doing their own thing. But, Amulya and I were just talking about this, is that we hope that, we made this policy, like, we put a lot of work into this, and we want to, give it to other people and they can change it however they might need to, like, for example, like some teams in California, like the resources that they would have for their local resources, like that's basically the only thing they might have to change. But the rest of the stuff is something that they could adopt.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you said that there was like a shift, right? I mean, as broadly as you want, could you talk about like what that shift was, how you experienced that?
Yeah, I can talk, and then Amulya, you can add on. There was a post, and there's a DDN Facebook group, and it was just talking about how kind of poorly as a community we handle instances of sexual violence. And just seeing that, I was like, my heart breaks, but I'm like, what, like personally, like what am I doing to help that? Like I can be as woke or as liberal as I want, but like what am I actually doing to create change in the community? And so that kind of shifted my mindset. And I think it was interesting because once I had that message, I talked to one of my friends, Eamon, about it. And then I just was like, okay, like I'm just going to contact like the leaders of DDN, because, in some ways they have like a lot more power than they realize. And I was like, at least like I can just, I'll just create a group chat with them and see, what's something that we can do, or like how I can best support it. And while I was doing that, there were a couple other, friend groups / like teams that were also doing that. So I don't know. I also just think like, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I just realized that like, if you want to see change, like you kind of have to create the change. Like, you know, like you can wait around for it, but I know I've felt so fulfilled with like creating the policy. Hard to describe, but I think, you know, for me, there was like a personal shift. And I also felt like in the community, there was a shift because after that, like I've seen so many comps, and also with quarantine, you know, like teams aren't performing, like comps aren't really happening. They're able to put in that time into these policies as well.
And I think more in general, it's like, I think with our community specifically, right? Like in the past and like even still now, right? We have this whole mindset of like, if anything happens, we keep it to ourselves. Like we can't tell anyone, or it's like, you know, it just becomes gossip rather than actual like, you know, conversation. And like we just push like everything under a rug, you know, and there's nothing ever been like concrete to address it. And I think a lot of it is like kind of this cultural mindset that we have like as a whole, you know, as a whole. And I think, you know, as Aditi said, with like BLM coming out and like other movements coming to the forefront, we like just, I think like everyone just realized, you know, there needs to be a change. And I think, you know, like a lot of like, there's like a lot of like anonymous like Twitter pages or like even like on Facebook group of like people saying like, hey, this happened at this location. And like a lot of people were like called out suddenly. Well, at least it was suddenly to me. Like I hadn't seen anything. And then a lot of posts came out at once of a lot of instances. And then that kind of overlapped with BLM, like other movements, and then like quarantine and all of that. So I think it was just, it kind of clicked that we had more time now, essentially, I guess, you know, because we weren't performing again. And, you know, I think we realized that we do need to change our mindset personally. And like me personally too, right? Like I know I should do more. And like, and I think a lot of people, like for me, is like, I want to do more, but I don't know what to do. And that's kind of like when Aditi reached out and being like, hey, I want to form this kind of coalition. Is there anyone specifically who wants to join the leadership? And I was like, that's kind of it gives me the opportunity. And I think hopefully kind of, you know, as our policy comes out and like, as like the SVR task force, they come out with their like, you know, their role and everything. It'll just give people like, you know, educating people on what's going on so like the shift can kind of continue to happen for other people and not just like little groups, and it just makes more of a change, I think.
You know, we realized like when we released to the public, like we've already discussed that, you know, we are going to get pushback. Like not all survivors are going to agree with what we're doing. Not all people in the community are going to agree with what we're doing, but like, you know, in general, we know we're taking a step in the right direction, even if it's not, you know, even if 90% of people are on board with it, I still think that we've accomplished something and we're taking a step in the right direction.
Yeah, well, I look forward to getting to check in with y'all once the policy is out, seeing how people respond. And I know that like, you're right? Like there's nothing that's gonna, you know, have the support 100% from the community because we are extremely diverse in like thought and just in person. But like, I'm sure that everyone can see that like, after so many years of inaction, y'all are taking a step that is, like you said, right, concrete. There's something actionable about it. Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up our conversation. Aditi, Amulya, thank you again for your expertise, your time, for talking with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.